So welcome everybody. I see a lot of new faces. Everybody welcome here. We spend this time every Friday at 9 p.m. to talk about self-improvement. I usually extract principles from works of fiction or nonfiction, or just any insights or analyses that I found from my own experience, my own journey. And for everybody that's returning, welcome back. I'm delighted for your decision to spend your evening with me. So today we are talking about The Alchemist. And if you have not read it, it's totally fine. I'm going to do a summary of the necessary and relevant points, and then we're going to dive into the interpretation, some implications, and then finally what we can take away from this story. Why is any of this important, and how we can use these principles to improve our lives. So the background of the story itself. There's actually a lot of different interpretations. If you guys heard when I was talking to Shrikant at the beginning, there's a lot of different interpretations of this book. And I think that's what makes a work of fiction actually beautiful in its own regard. So I chose to do the value of tribulations because we have a main character. The dominant narrative of the story is a young man. His name is Santiago, and he is a shepherd. So he has a herd of sheep that he travels around, and that's his way of income. He shears them and he sells wool at marketplaces and things like this. So he originally had this, I guess, profession as a goal because it allowed him to travel the world. Because when he was a young boy, he had a recurring dream. This is the most important part. He had a recurring dream of him receiving treasure near the pyramids of Egypt. It was kind of vague. It was kind of foggy. He didn't really have a lot of details. He didn't really know what are the steps he should take to actualize and materialize this dream. But he decided to chase this dream, try to manifest this, try to find this treasure in a distant land. So this entire book is about his journey, his conquest to find this treasure. So along this pathway between him and his treasure, there are a majority of tribulations. I've identified 9 that I want to talk about in the story here. Now, keep in mind that these tribulations might not be unequivocally detrimental. In other words, some of them might actually look like blessings, but they are still obstacles between him and his desired result, the object of his desire being his treasure. So the first major tribulation that he comes across is early on in the book. He is traveling to a different city, and he meets a merchant's daughter. And he convinces himself that he is in love with this daughter. He's infatuated with her. And I quote from the book, he says, "This is the first time in my life that I wanted to stay in one place forever." And we know that his very ideal to pick the profession of a shepherd was the only, I guess it was a modality. It was a means to an end. He doesn't like being a shepherd in himself, but he uses it as a tool to get to his journey of his treasure. So he likes traveling. And for the first time, he experiences infatuation with a girl. And he says, "I want to stay in this place forever. I want to build a life with you." So that's actually an obstacle in the long run. But in the short term, it looks like it's beneficial. So that's one major tribulation. The second, we're going to move right through again. There's 9 major ones. The second is he recalls an instance in his life where he has a flashback of his father actually discouraging him from going on these travels. So when he's a young boy, he's saying to his father, "I want to travel. I want a profession that allows me to explore the world." And his father is kind of encouraging more towards, I would say, security and like a stable job, right? A safe paycheck, something that's stable. And he chooses the profession of a shepherd, but his father kind of discourages this. And he says, "No, listen, you'll travel all around the world, but our countryside is the most beautiful. We have the most beautiful women. We have the best culture, et cetera, et cetera." He tries to get him to stay in one place. This is from Spain, by the way. So that's the second tribulation. The third tribulation, he decides to get past these 2, and he decides to keep thinking about his dream, his recurring dream. It keeps coming to him, keeps occupying his consciousness. So he decides to go toward this woman whose profession is to interpret dreams for him. So she says, "Okay, sit down, explain the details. Let's work out the details with you." And the only concrete evidence she supplies him with is, "Okay, your personal legend, your destiny, your fate is near the pyramids of Egypt. That's clearly your task. That's clearly your life goal. You have to fulfill that." And he turns around and he says, "Okay, what are some practicalities? Like, where do I look for what do I look for in Egypt? How do I know if I'm on the right path? Am I looking for a person in Egypt? Is this treasure buried? Is this treasure in the pyramids, etc.?" He has all these practical questions, justifiably. But her response is, "I only know how to interpret dreams. I don't know how to manifest them." So he's very discouraged at this point. And I quote from the book, he says, "At that moment, I decided that I would never again believe in the power of dreams." So that's another tribulation. That's another obstacle in his journey. So, but he decides to trudge forward and push on anyway. He actually sells his entire flock of sheep to purchase tickets through the desert to travel closer to Egypt. So he sells his whole flock. He's uncertain. He has no really. This is the I would say the contemporary equivalent of quitting your job to start a business, right? You sold everything you have. You're uncertain. You don't know about the future, but he's trying to get closer to his dream. Okay, so that's the third tribulation. The fourth, he arrives at a city somewhere down his path. I forget what city it was or what country. It's not really important, but he's sitting down in a bar or some type of restaurant, and he meets this other young man about his age. And he's talking to him. He's telling him about his journey. He's telling him, oh, I need to get to Egypt. I'm looking for something in Egypt. I have to get there. So the other young man, he says, okay, how much money do you have? I'm a specialist in travel or something. So he lets him count his money. He lets him keep his money on him for whatever reason. And he's a little bit skeptical, but he doesn't want to be rude and ask for it back, and because he wants to like build friendships or build connections. So he places his trust in this other young man with his money foolishly. So long story short, the young man goes to the marketplace with Santiago, and he says, hey, let's make some investments. Let's flip your money so you can make profits and get closer to Egypt. So Santiago's like, okay, cool. So they're in the marketplace, very crowded, very busy. And lo and behold, of course, understandably, the young man just scams him. He distracts him. He gets his attention. He points him towards some other obstacle, and then he just runs away with all of his money. So this young man is completely flat broke, despondent, depressed, in despair. He's overwhelmed. He doesn't know what to do. He's overwhelmed. He starts crying, and he sleeps in the middle of the street of the marketplace that night. He's almost ready to give up all hope and just find his way back to safety, find his way back to Spain. At least he has a comfortable family, and he could always, scrape by and save up for a herd of sheep again in Spain. But he pulls himself together and he decides, you know what? No, I've already overcame these, 3 or 4 obstacles in my journey. I'm already like miles and miles away from my house. Let me at least try to make this thing work a little bit more. So he walks around this town, this marketplace. He ends up finding a crystal shop. This crystal shop is owned by an older gentleman, and it's kind of ill kept. It's not really presentable. So the young man walks up to the old man. Santiago walks up to the old man. He says, hey, give me a commission for your sales, and I will make your storefront more appealing to the customer. I'll try to, increase the sales. I'll clean up a little bit. I'll, help you with inventory and stocking and keeping track and all this. So this old man's like, okay, he accepts. Santiago is there for an entire year. And again, this looks like a blessing, but it is an obstacle. For once he saves up a lot of money for this entire year of work, the business is doing very well. He has twice the money he's ever had in his life. So he's thinking, okay, what can I do with this money? I can go back to Spain now. I can afford the ticket back to Spain. I can buy twice the flock that I once had, and I can travel the rest of my life. Okay, he starts to entertain this idea. He starts to entertain going back to safety. Again, Abraham Maslow said, at any moment, we have the option of stepping forward into growth or stepping backward into safety. So he's entertaining these thoughts of doubt, of security, of abandoning his dream so he can have a stable future. And then he kind of snaps into it. He's like, you know what? No, a year has passed. Yes, I am comfortable. But again, he's justifying it. I've already gone through these obstacles. Even though a year has passed, I'm at least an hour or 2 closer to my dream, right? So he justifies it that way with a very positive attitude. So he decides to push forward regardless, buys a ticket with this little travel caravan into the desert towards Egypt. And the next obstacle, the 6th one, is there is a war going on in the desert. So he is forced to derail his trajectory, and they end up in this little oasis town for an uncertain amount of time. They don't know how long the war is going on. They don't know when they're going to get closer to Egypt, etc. So that's very discouraging for the young man as well. So that's the 6th. The 7th obstacle, he finds yet another young woman in this town, and he again gets infatuated with her and convinces himself he's in love with her. And he says, hey, look, I have a lot of money with me. I have, all this knowledge. We can start our own shop here. I would love to live here in this oasis. It seems comfortable. I like the desert lifestyle. It seems appealing to me, etc. So yet again, he is tempted by safety and complacency and mediocrity, although in the surface, it sounds good, right? It sounds good to him because he thinks he's in love with her. So he kind of comes to his senses and he's like, no, this isn't my journey. This isn't my destiny. The war, somebody announces actually the war is ended so they can proceed. So he's like, okay, he's tempted with this decision again of, in the words of Maslow, stepping forward into growth or stepping back into safety. So he decides to push on. And again, he hits the next obstacle, the 8th obstacle, which is he runs into some, I don't know what you would call them. I guess like a group of soldiers in the desert from the war, probably. Some residual, like there's little battles going on. And long story short, he gets held captive, kind of gets held hostage, and they take everything he has off of him and a little travel caravan. So they take all of his money yet again. So he's broke, completely penniless for a second time in his journey, completely broke. He's despondent, but he decides to just push on anyway because he doesn't want to get killed by these people. So he decides to push on anyway. And before the final obstacle, so the ninth obstacle is as follows. He is, mind you, at this point, he literally has nothing left to lose. He's lost everything he's owned. He's went through two potentially pleasing and beneficial relationships. He's sacrificed friendships. He's sacrificed, safety and security with his family. He's left his hometown. He's thousands of miles away. He's lonely. He's alone in the desert. He doesn't know if he's going to die, but he decides to push on forward anyway. He finally finds the pyramids. So he's in complete awe at the beauty and majesty of these pyramids, and he's like, "Oh my God, I completely made it!" But kind of reality starts to set in a little bit, and it hits him. Okay, I'm surrounded by literally hundreds of square miles of sand. Where do I start digging? Again, the lady that interpreted his dream didn't give him any practical details. He doesn't know if it's right under him. He doesn't know if it's under the pyramid. He doesn't know if it's in the pyramid, etc. So he just falls to his knees. He starts crying. He's overwhelmed. And he decides, screw it, I'll just start digging right here. It can't hurt. So he starts digging right where he's standing, right when he sees the pyramids. And then two soldiers walk by and they notice him digging. And they're like, okay, why would you be digging in the middle of the desert? You must be hiding something. There must be something of value here, or else you wouldn't go looking for it. So they stand over the hole, force him to dig, nearly beat him senseless, almost to death. And they're like, okay, you're going to find whatever's here, whatever treasure you're looking for, whatever valuables you have here locked away. You're going to find them. We're going to take them from you, or we're going to kill you. So he's just completely overwhelmed at this point. He's so mind you, this entire journey, this is probably the last 10 pages of the book. His entire journey, he is not quantifiably closer to his goal. Okay. All those tribulations, all those 9 tribulations, going broke multiple times, losing everything he has. He is no closer to his dream because he's still uncertain. And now he thinks he's about to die. So the twist of the story, he actually admits to the two soldiers. He says, you know what? I don't even really know what I'm doing here. I just had a foolish dream when I was a young boy of, treasure in a distant land near the pyramids. And I decided to follow this dream foolishly. And here I am. And the guys are like, all right, this guy, he's just a delirious dreamer, right? They just write it off. They scoff and they walk away. And one of the soldiers says to the boy, he's like, you're a foolish dreamer. I once had a recurring dream too of treasure in a distant land, except it was under a sycamore tree in an abandoned building. And the twist here is that sycamore tree in the abandoned building is exactly literally where the first page of this journey starts. So long story short, it's like a beautiful twist of fate. The boy's journey literally started above the treasure. So you could look at that in a practical term or a metaphorical term. He's always had the treasure all along, but he had to go through all of those tribulations in order to find the treasure, in order to be worthy of the treasure, in order to subjectively value the treasure at a higher rate, because he went through all of that. He invested all of that. So if you look at it in a different way, he didn't lose his money twice. He didn't lose his friendships. He invested those into his journey for receiving the treasure. So the story ends, and there is an epilogue. The treasure actually was under the sycamore tree where it started. So it was a huge cyclical journey that he had to go on. So that is a summary of the book. Again, we can go under a lot of different interpretations. You can talk about unshakable faith. You can talk about other instances, but I want to talk about the value of tribulations. And to do that, I'm going to explain this point with a few quotes. The first is from Henry David Thoreau in his book Walden, where he says, "It is a vulgar error to assume that you have tasted a fruit you have not picked." Okay, what does that mean? It is a vulgar error to assume you've tasted something you haven't picked. So in other words, if you haven't voluntarily labored for it, if you haven't sacrificed, if you haven't gone out of your way deliberately or invested or suffered or sacrificed for something, you don't really understand its value, or you're going to undervalue it, or you're going to have a contemptuous attitude toward it, even if it's objectively and unequivocally valuable. You're not going to have the correct attitude toward it. And conversely, if something is around you in your familiar circumstances, it's going to breed contempt, right? Familiarity breeds contempt. We tend to undervalue what is constantly around us, what we don't sacrifice for. So you can look at this in a practical term of people that inherit things, or people that say somebody inherits their wealth. They're going to spend it very foolishly. They're not going to take care of it. Whereas if somebody was, a rags to riches story, they're going to have a very different paradigm about wealth because they earned it, because they went through several tribulations and sacrifices for it. And Nietzsche actually points this out again in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, very similar to the words of Thoreau, where he says, one should not wish to enjoy where one did not contribute to the enjoyment. So contribute to the enjoyment. So in other words, you've earned that pleasure. You've earned the right to value that thing. And I wanted to actually interject with a quick autobiographical story of account of my own life to kind of highlight and instantiate this point of subjective value on something. And to do that, I'll explain actually this meetup itself right here. So before this whole COVID thing, before this all this meetup was virtual, we were actually doing this in person. Shrikant has been hosting these for years. My first meetup actually here with Shrikant was my first trip to New York was December 2nd, 2017. So I have this journal, this is from 2018. And why I bring up my trips to New York is because if you guys have ever met me in person and you've heard this story from the investments into the meetups themselves, it takes me about 3.5 hours commute one way to get to these meetups when we were holding them in New York in person. So that's 7 hours of travel in one day, and I was going every single week. So that's at least 500 hours a year in just travel. That's not counting the hour or two of discussion, of watching the person present, of watching the lecture, etc. And so we have the, I guess, temporal investment of time of 500 hours at minimum, probably 600 or 700. And we also have the financial investment. So for me to get from where I am, east of Hartford, about 30 minutes, all the way to New York, spend a weekend there, it's roughly, I'd say, $200 a weekend. So over the course of 1 year, times 50, that is $10,000. So in short, this notebook, literally this notebook, is worth $200 a page to me. So this notebook, I sacrificed 600 hours and $10,000 to get. Now, if I look at, let's say, a parallel universe me, or even more simple, if I copy this notebook verbatim and I send you the notes, you are not going to value it the same level I value it because we don't have as much invested in it. Okay, I've sacrificed, I've gone through trials and tribulations, I've invested into the information that is here, so I'm going to hold it in higher regard, subjectively, in a standard sense speaking. So I think we value what is harder to obtain innately. I think that's just human nature, and it makes a lot of sense. So if you have two people that arrive at the same conclusion, but person one sacrificed and suffered more and went through more tribulations to get that, I think they're going to have a lot more conviction, more belief, and more value in the same object. So I used the example earlier of inherited wealth. So let's say you're born into a wealthy family and you inherit a beachfront house. Okay, you're going to be contemptuous toward it. Okay, it's this, but it's not. It's nothing compared to my friend's house. It's nothing compared to my parents' house, etc. You're not going to value it because you didn't earn it. Whereas, I use the example again, rags to riches story. If a person was struggling, getting their business off the ground for 10, 15, 20 years to make their first sale, and then they eventually earned and got their financial education competent enough to earn valuable income, and then they finally purchased the house of their dreams, okay, they are going to value that a lot more, even though these two people have the same exact house. Okay, even if you have this same notebook, even if we have the same, you can look at this in any result of life. So I think we're going to value more what is harder to obtain. And that's why this young man, Santiago, valued the treasure so much, because he went through literally life and death circumstances.
John, may I make a comment?
Yeah.
Okay. The way I applied that is, we had about 300 regulars come to these meetups, and John would show up every week. So the way I apply this principle is that my standard for my meetups is that it should be worth John's while to come. Right. Because if it is going to be John's while to travel 7 hours to get there and spend $200 per meetup, it's going to be worth anybody's while. So I use the fact that this was a big value to him as a way of calibrating it. Is this going to be worth it? After all of this effort, is every person walking away with something that is worth that much? And if that is there, and I know that John is a very hard thinking person, he has very clear standards and he holds himself and others to very high standards. So that was a very good way in order to kind of implement this principle in my meetups. Over to you, John.
Yeah, and more appreciation to you for holding these, and for holding these for literally years and years and years. For anybody who's new, Shrikant is not new to this. He is true to this, as we would say. So going back to the point of, I guess, valuing things off of tribulation, I want to read one quote from, this is from Genealogy of Morals in Nietzsche, where he says, "Man does not repudiate suffering in itself. He wills it. He even seeks it out, provided," this is the important point, "provided he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose of suffering. Not suffering, but the senselessness of suffering is the curse which spreads over humanity." So in other words, I wouldn't look at something as a loss. I wouldn't look at something as suffering. I wouldn't look at something as you becoming less of a person if you have a goal, okay? So let's say Santiago didn't have this treasure to look for, okay? Then everything was a loss. Everything, he lost his money, he lost his job, he lost his certainty, he lost his flock of sheep, he lost his relationships, he lost that girl that in the desert, etc. But if you have a goal, if you have an ideal to invest in, again, a purpose for your suffering, if you apply it to something, if you establish a end that's going to justify the means, everything becomes an investment, okay? With that attitude, there is literally no such thing as a loss. I don't want to posit myself as an overly optimistic person by saying you can't lose, but if you have an established ideal, if you establish a goal, a desire, a dream, a treasure, okay, nothing is a loss. Everything is an investment. Everything is recalibrating you toward that journey, provided you don't make the same mistake twice. If you make the same mistake twice, you're not paying enough attention. So with that said, a practical sense of that, you look at suffering. Suffering is omnipresent. It's in all of our lives, in the sense of everybody is going to lose somebody they love. Everybody is going to get sick. Everybody's going to die. And even if you want to take less of a bleak approach, you can look at more trivial manifestations of suffering. Everybody's going to get exploited. Everybody's going to be taken advantage of. Everybody is going to be badmouthed. Everybody's going to be criticized. Everybody's going to experience stress or loneliness or isolation, etc. All these things are inevitable in life, okay? And if you have an ideal to justify all of that, then they are much more bearable, okay? And that's exactly Nietzsche's core philosophy, is that it's not suffering in itself. We actually need suffering in order to transpire. We need that goal to transpire the suffering and justify it. Okay, so finally, I want to move on into the application. So what we can learn from the story and everything that I just said with the value of tribulations and suffering and establishing an ideal, etc. And the first, I guess, phenomenon I want to talk about is the notion of earning your pleasures. So I talked about this in a Nietzsche quote: "One should not wish to enjoy where one did not contribute to the enjoyment." So contribute to the enjoyment. What does that mean? I want to talk about a phenomenon called escapism. Okay, so escapism, I'll explain it in the following way. In life, let's look at common denominators of, I guess, tangentially negative emotions. So they're not crazy, they're not overwhelming, but they're just generally a sense of like feeling right? Stress, feeling bored, feeling lonely, overwhelmed, overworked, you're tired, etc. Like they're not really that detrimental, but there's the seedlings of detrimental. Okay, so those are the common denominators. Those are in everybody's lives, okay? So it is what we do in light of that, how we choose to express that, how we choose to overcome that determines the outcome of our lives. So we have that, okay, that's impressed in our consciousness. Okay, so I'm stressed and you're stressed. And we have person A and person B. Okay, a person A, he engages in escapes, and escapes can manifest in several ways. They can manifest in compulsive lying. They can manifest in even drugs or alcohol. They can manifest in gambling. They can express themselves through binge watching movies. They can express themselves in video games, right? They're just escapes from reality, okay? And short term, they actually they appear to solve the problem, because when you're binge watching movies, when you're playing video games, when you're drinking, gambling, whatever like this temporary thing is, you get a hit of dopamine, okay? So you get alleviation from this feeling of stress, from this tangentially related slight like seedling of negativity, okay? But here's the thing: long term, that seedling manifests and grows into, instead of like loneliness, it's borderline depression, or it's borderline isolation, or it's borderline just feeling contemptuous toward life, or being nihilistic, or being depressed, or even suicidal. So that's orders of magnitude more powerful and more impactful and more negative than the initial result, okay? And mind you, keep in mind, this is a cycle, because once you engage in that little escape, okay, cool, but then you get hit with guilt after, and then guilt is one of these small, I guess, feelings, and then you engage in another escape, and that's how you spiral downhill. And then that's how you wake up in your 40s or 50s or 60s or whatever year, whatever decade it happens to be, and you're broke, you're depressed, you're lonely, you're isolated, you're out of touch with your family, no one likes you, you don't know what happened. You wake up and you ask yourself, what happened to me? Okay, nothing happens to you. You always choose your circumstances. So anyways, that's a negative spiral. The positive spiral is you take that common denominator of stress, of overwhelm, of overworked, of bored, of lonely, and you develop coping skills. Okay, so you address them. Instead of running from your problems, you run towards your problems. You address them. You say, okay, why am I feeling this? Let's say you're stressed or overwhelmed in a relationship. You can develop coping skills. You can confront the person. And now short term, what does this look like? It's uncomfortable, right? No one wants to do this. It might elicit fear. It might elicit worry. It might break off the relationship. You might be overwhelmed. You might be uncertain. It's in short, it's uncomfortable short term. But here's the thing: long term, it arrives at freedom. Okay, you no longer see that manifestation of stress in that relationship again. Or if you do again, it'll be in a different context and you'll address it. If you address it correctly with coping skills, it's not going to remanifest itself. So the lesson continues, or the resistance persists until the lesson is extracted from it. Okay, so that's the phenomenon of escapism. Once you have these temporary, I guess, feelings, you should isolate them. You should look at why you're feeling them and look at what you can do in the short term and long term to alleviate these in a healthy and constructive way. So that is work, but again, long term, it leads to freedom. So that's escapism. And the second point I want to talk about, I have two more, sorry. The second point is to simply invest in ourselves. Okay, invest in ourselves in our journeys. Now, I think the amount that we invest in ourselves is directly proportionate to our belief of our future. So I'll give you a simple analogy. If I told you that a stock, a business stock, or pick a random stock, Tesla, Amazon, whatever, was guaranteed to increase 300% in 1 year, okay? I'm guaranteed. I'll show you proof. I'll show you statistics. I'll show you indicators on a chart, etc. What would you do with that information? If it was guaranteed, you would logically invest every spare dollar that you had in it because you had unequivocal faith, incontrovertible faith that it's going to be more valuable, and thus you were going to get a bigger return out of it. Okay, so superimpose that back to your individual life. If you have unshakable faith in your ideal, in your future, if you've clearly mapped out and conceptualized your treasure, your personal destiny, your journey, your goal, your deadline, whatever you want to call this, whatever word you want to superimpose onto this, if you clearly map it out, you build that picture in your imagination, you capture it on paper, you know exactly what you want in every single area of your life, of your health, of your career, of your relationships, of your income, of your finances, of your family, etc., in specific, great detail. And you're doing the positive things every day. You're developing coping skills. You're not indulging in escapism. You have disciplines. You're tracking your progress. You're getting outside of your comfort zone. You're surrounding yourself with the right people. You're surrounding yourself with the people with the constructive mindset who have results you want. You have a public accountability partner who's going to call you out on your shit if you're lacking or you're struggling on your goals. You have all of those things in place. If you have incontrovertible faith in your future, you become the person who spends $10,000 in a notebook. Okay, you become that's nothing, by the way. You'll become the type of person who spends thousands of dollars in coaching. You'll travel across the United States to go to a lecture or a seminar because you think it's going to get you closer to your established ideal. Okay, so you're going to invest every spare dollar you have in your journey if you have faith in your future. If you don't have faith in your future, you might say, oh, no, I don't want to go read that book. That's a lot of my time. I don't want to spend that much money on a coach. That's a lot of money. What? That's not worth it. Okay. It's always commensurate, always proportionate to the amount of money you invest in yourself, not even just money, time, resources, attention, etc. All your resources, the amount you invest into yourself is directly proportionate to your faith in your future. So next point I have here is simply to test our boundaries. So if we have, I would say growth in any area happens at the precipice of, you can look at it in sense of order and chaos. You can look at it certainty and uncertainty. I would say right at our boundaries. So test your boundaries in all areas of your life, test your comfort zone. And I think even if we are doing something that is irrefutably positive and constructive, and we are increasing that in an exponential way. So let me back away from the vocabulary for a second. Let's look at it practical. So let's look at exercise. I always talk about exercise because it's very relevant to my life and it's very easy to measure things in numbers. So let's look at exercise. Okay, that is unequivocally beneficial. All right, you're going to be in better shape. You look, feel, and perform better. It's going to increase your cardiovascular load. It's going to, exercise is proven to increase blood flow to the brain. You're going to think better. You're going to perform better in your job, in your career, in every area of your life. You're going to feel better. Exercise has been proven to mitigate the damage of your telomere length, therefore lengthening and prolonging your lifespan. Okay, unequivocally beneficial exercise. All right, cool. So with that in mind, I want all those benefits. So I'm going to do 5 push-ups a day. All right, and I'm also going to increase this. I'm also going to make this exponentially more difficult. So from January, I'll add 1 a month. So from January to December, I start at 5. I end up at 17. All right. So that's unequivocally a positive action, and it's increasing my load. But here's the thing. I didn't test the boundary. Okay. 5 push-ups is literally nothing. 17 push-ups is literally nothing. What if I can do 40 or 50 in one set? Okay. I'm not hitting my boundary. And now if this is ethereal and amorphous for anybody in terms of fitness, you can look at it in any realm of your life. If I'm reading books that are only within my vocabulary level, if I'm only reading books that I understand 100% of all the arguments of the propositions, I completely grasp everything the author is getting, I'm not testing my boundaries. I'm not growing intellectually. If I'm in a relationship and I'm only in mutual agreement 100% with my partner, and I'm not addressing what needs to be addressed, I'm not having uncomfortable conversations, I'm not saying no when I want to say no, I'm not drawing my boundaries, I'm not asking for what I want out of that person, I'm not setting my intentions with that person, that means I'm not hitting boundaries and I'm not growing. This relationship isn't growing. It's going to stagnate and wither and die. And my emotional, I guess, growth would be stagnant as well. So in short, I would say test your boundaries in as many realms of your life as you can. Because that is exactly where growth happens, right on that border, sometimes even past your boundary. And I always use fitness because it's the most prominent example, because what actually happens in muscle growth is your fibers, a lot of people don't know this, your fibers are actually tearing. The muscle fibers are actually ripping. They're being destroyed. So if you ever had a workout, or if you went hiking one day and your legs are sore or something, that's actually your body repairing itself, because all of the microscopic tears in your muscles. You've actually literally damaged your body, and there's a lot of inflammation, and your body thinks it's under a lot of stress. So what it does is there's 2 forms of hypertrophy. There is myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. This is random details. But in short, your fiber actually gets thicker and it gets more dense, and that's what actually makes muscles grow, because you were on the border of your boundaries. You surpassed your boundaries. You didn't think it was possible. So extrapolate that to all possible realms of our life. And in short, I guess as a complete summation, I would say fail fast, fail often, and recalibrate. Okay, have a healthy attitude toward failure, and then establish this entire topic today is contingent upon the fact that we have an ideal. If you don't have an ideal to suffer for, none of this matters. We're not going to push through the suffering. We're not going to see the justification in overcoming and surmounting these tribulations. Okay, so we have to have this ideal. We have to have treasure that we are looking for in life, and then we will fail often, fail fast, have a positive, constructive attitude, and we'll make investments into ourselves and into our future. So with that said, I'm going to hand it back over to Shrikant for moderation of questions.
Thanks, John. So the plan is we're going to do Q&A now. Then we're going to do breakout rooms for 30 minutes. And we're going to come back and share our takeaways and have a discussion on the topic. So for the questions, try to keep them on topic and brief and courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything, but do so courteously. All right. And those same rules apply in the breakout rooms. All right, so it's going to be Joe, followed by Tanya, Jonathan, Marina, Aaron, and Jean. You can continue to line up for questions by typing something in the chat. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, John. Thanks for comment. It was another great presentation, so I really appreciate it. Really quickly, one of the meditations on Tuesday evening was the idea of heading into pain and actually embracing our pain, and actually as a way of getting it better. So I found that to be an interesting parallel just to a recent meditation exercise that we went through on Tuesday. But one of the other things that I had thought about when I was reading this book was one of your other discussions on the vestibule of hell, and the idea that the opposite of indecision and what the penalty is with that, and the opportunists are the people that take advantage of him along the journey. And I found that to be a really interesting part, link between two discussions that you had on self-improvement. On one end, you have this indecision and I see that almost in the father's feelings of what he gives him the 3 gold coins to go out to proceed on his journey. And but I think that that's a really interesting contrast as to how indecision is also the detriment of indecision in your previous discussion, and the beauty of embracing one's journey and tribulations in the Alchemist.
That's a very good insight. I wasn't even thinking of the vestibule in Dante's Inferno when I was thinking about that. I was only kind of conceptualizing it from like, okay, if I was Santiago, like how would I act in these things? You know what I mean? But you're absolutely right. He was exploited and kind of taken advantage of because he didn't have that certainty, or he didn't have that decision-making process to say, okay, I'm following this decision to manifest my dream unequivocally. Like, I'm going to do this. He kind of fluctuated a lot. He said, okay, I'm a little bit closer, but like I'm comfortable. Oh, I guess I'll go. Sure. I'll sell my sheep. Yeah, I guess. Okay, I met this girl. She's beautiful. She's wonderful. I guess I'll stay here, actually. This actually sounds a lot better. And then he does that multiple times. So he's actually being kind of thrown around by circumstance, by external stimuli, by external stimulants, and being manipulated that way. That's absolutely true, because he didn't have faith in his outcome. He was uncertain in that outcome. So therefore he was able to be exploited and misled. And I think if he was like crystal clear, like had a lot of faith in that outcome, he wouldn't have been misled. Then the book wouldn't be as valuable, of course, but like that is a really good insight. And yeah, to talk about the value of pain itself with your meditation, one of my favorite quotes is from Seneca, where he says, "I judge you unfortunate because you have never experienced misfortune. No one knows what you are capable of, not even you." So that goes back to my summarization of the boundaries. Like, the boundaries are where you define your character. You don't know how capable you are until you don't know where your boundaries are until you hit them, right? So you should hit your boundaries and then try to strengthen them and expand them a little bit. And then you can accurately define the constituents of your character. But if you don't hit your boundaries, you have no idea. And that's, I think, the biggest tragedy is like unused potential.
Thanks, John. Next up is Tanya. Tanya, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't have a question, but I was enjoying this whole lecture. It was really great. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Jonathan. Go ahead, Jonathan. Okay, Jonathan.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Epic presentation, John.
Thank you.
Again. So one thing that we're exploring the value of trial and tribulations, and I was hoping you'd comment also on how it relates to going out into the world and seeing things for yourself. Because one thing that I noticed in the book when I was reading was, there are a lot of characters like the Englishman, and he's absorbed in texts and books, and he's reading about treasure, but it takes him 10 years to go out and actually search for the treasure. And you can apply it to other things you've mentioned, like when you're talking about you took a train or whatever it was, 7 hours to go to a meetup, when you could have just told yourself, oh, well, I'd rather just be at home and talk to people about these subjects on a forum. Or instead of going to a lecture across the country, you could stay at home and be like, let me just watch it on YouTube. So I'm just hoping you'd comment a bit on that process of actually going out into the world, doing things, even though you may not see an immediate value, and how that then relates to the, this lens of viewing things through trial and tribulations.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, the whole hierarchy of subjective valuation of results, of circumstances, of possessions, of material goods, etc., I think is directly commensurate to the amount that we've invested into it. So my aim in my personal life, my personal philosophy is like always invest in myself when I can. Now, someone might objectively be like, you can play devil's advocate and say, oh, John, but couldn't I can literally get all of this information in this book on the internet for free. Or I could have just sent someone to the meetup and said, hey, let me compare your notes, or just like take notes for me, right? I could have done that too. In other words, I could get like literally an exact atom for atom replica of this, but let's say I just never went out of my way to New York for it, or I never spent $1 on it, or a parallel universe me is in possession of this. I would completely overlook everything in this book. because I haven't gone out. So in short, like part of my philosophy is always when I have the option, if I have the resources, if I have the money, if I have the time, I always invest in myself, even if I can find a cheaper option. Okay, I don't look for cheaper options. I don't believe in shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to any place worth getting to. And if I was going to shortchange myself, that indicates I don't have faith in myself. Okay, if I'm going to look for a discount on investing into me, I think it's a very detrimental philosophy, and it's bred of ill faith. I would say of a little bit of faith in our future. So that's always my philosophy inherently, and I do agree with you. The point how he kind of paralleled this in other people's lives. He saw them as examples. I think the most prominent one for me was the crystal shop owner. He was, I forget what religion, but he always wanted to go to Mecca and do that like prayer ceremony, and he was like this old man. He just like kind of just like washed up, and like the young man Santiago was like, listen, I don't ever want to become like that. Like this is kind of a parallel. Like he has a dream and he kind of just gave up. He's making good money here at this crystal shop, but like I can tell deep down he's unsatisfied. I don't want to become that. So he did have these little omens, the book calls it, in terms of helping him realize his dream and looking at other people as examples of what to do, but I think mainly what not to do in this case.
Okay, so it's going to be, next up is going to be Marina, followed by Aaron and Jean. Marina, go ahead.
So I typed it up, but you were talking, so you probably didn't read it. And it's not that I don't, it's not that I disagree with you that we create our own destiny, but I don't believe that everybody always chooses their circumstances, because, excuse me, nobody would ever choose abusive parents, and nobody ever choose cancer. There are things you have control over, and there are things that you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. But in light of that, what is always within our control is our conscious response toward those circumstances. I think a lot of people, an estimate, I would say about 97% of people, react to their circumstances. They're emotionally reactive. They go with their first judgment, and this is encapsulated. If you were here a few weeks ago, I did the presentation on the two frogs in the well. This was encapsulated in that dichotomy. A lot of people are emotionally reactive. They think short term. They don't think into the future. They don't have an established ideal. They live their lives by proximity and not design. Therefore, they are thrown back and forth by circumstance, as Joe was talking about in the first point. But we always have the option on how to respond. Okay, now it's not always easy. It's not always immediately accessible to us. We might have to pause and reflect. We have to have a lot of self-control. And if anybody is doubtful of this point, I strongly implore them to read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. He was a survivor of the concentration camps in the Holocaust. But throughout this entire thing, he remained in possession of a positive and constructive attitude. He had an ideal established. He kept thinking about his future life when he was subject to this physical and mental torment. So I think that completely invalidates anybody's circumstances, I would say in America, to be honest, being in a concentration camp. And him having that ability, and not only ability, but tendency to execute on his ability and implement his philosophy, that completely invalidates, I would say, any circumstances.
Aaron, you're next.
Hi, John. Really enjoyed your talk today and the one last week on Flowers for Elegon. One thing that I did have a question about is you mentioned investing money in yourself. And, you know, I did sit on another lecture that we had here about the Stoics. I'm wondering where exactly money plays into the equation. Like, shouldn't I be able to, you know, use a library card, work out at home, take a jog, and go to this free meetup right now and better myself? Like, why does money necessarily have to be in that equation in self-betterment?
Because I think money is just simply a tool for access. Money allows you more access to resources. You will never have, I would say, I wouldn't say one individual always has the resources. I was actually just talking about this. I had a discussion about this previous. I said, if somebody doesn't deliberately like seek out new information, it's operating under the assumption that all of their aggregate input has all of the information they need to get from where they are to where they know that they should and need to be in their life. So in short, I think a very practical application of this can be a mentor or a coach, somebody who has the results that you want in your life, and you pay them for their expertise. You pay them for their advice. A philosophy that instantiates this is a quote from Thomas Carlyle, where he says, "All that mankind has thought, done, gained, or been is lying as in magic preservation in the pages of books." So yes, you can argue, yeah, I'll go to the library, I'll do all this for free. But I could have made the same assumption with everything that's in this book here. I could have got all this at the library. I could have had somebody get this information for me for free. But here's the thing, I'm not that invested in it. Yes, I invested a little bit of time going to the library, etc. But I mean, if it's time plus $500, you're going to pay attention a lot more. If you had to buy a book for $500, you're going to pay a lot more attention. And that's the reason why I would implore like a financial investment into the future. Because you're never going to figure everything out on your own. And you might not value the actions that you're doing right now as much as you would if you coupled them with a financial investment. That's why.
Thanks, John. So it's going to be Jean, Christian, and Steve next. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I want to respond a little bit what Aaron was asking. One experience I want to share is like I joined the landmark training. The people who actually...
Jean, what we're doing here is that we are doing at this point, we are doing questions. What we can do is that after
okay, that's fine. Okay, that's okay.
We will do takeaways in the takeaway section.
That's okay. That's question? Okay. Yeah. So I want to say, the reason I joined this, I usually don't join the Friday ones because I read this book. My son, 6th grade, they're learning this as language art, and I happened to help him. And I read the story. I was fascinated by the story. It's so much depth in the story. And I found, my understanding is a little bit different from what the presenter present. My experience, my understanding of the book is like the boy had this big dream that's driving him to go through all the troubles to end up in Egypt. And the interesting thing is when they actually at Egypt, he realized there's nothing there. So he ended up actually found it at his home, so it's actually, what I learned from this is like the dream actually bring us to experience, but this dream actually helped to experience all the things he experienced. He learned on the way, but the treasure actually is at his hometown or where he used to be. So that's what I learned from this novel. I'm sure everybody learned their own things. That's why the book is so interesting, because you learn, everybody have their own interpretation of the story, and there's so much metaphor in there and so much depth in there. And it's actually, I just want to share that. Maybe because of my age, so my understanding is like, just like I travel everywhere, then every time I come home, I say, oh, it's so great to be home. So it's like the reason I go out just to enjoy home better. So that's my feeling.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up is going to be Christian, Steve, and Deborah. Christian, go ahead.
So I really enjoyed the lecture. One thing that came up is that I'm one of those people that I push really, really hard past my comfort zone. But one thing that I've kind of struggled with is balance. Like, how do you balance pushing past your comfort zone without burning yourself out?
That's a very good question. That's actually, if you stick around in like 5 or 10 minutes, we're actually going to go into breakout groups. And that is one of the questions that I had facilitated on this discussion, because there's a lot of different interpretations that you can answer that question by. So we're going to get to the questions in a minute, but in short, I mean, my answer would just be frequent tracking and frequent checking in with yourself in terms of emotion, in terms of resources, in terms of your attention span, etc. Okay, so don't burn yourself out to where you are emotionally drained, you are financially drained, or you can't even pay attention anymore because you're focusing on the same thing repetitively and repeatedly. So have frequent check-ins with yourself. This can manifest itself in a evening or morning routine. This can manifest itself in a weekly accountability group with friends. This can be either, so in terms of neuroscience and psychology, we're motivated by one of two things. It's either the avoidance of pain or the desire of pleasure. Okay, so you can reward yourself when you are going outside of your comfort zone, either with a pleasure, like you go out with you go out with your friends one night or something like this, whatever is your motivating pleasure, or you have some sort of, I guess, detrimental ramification if you don't hit your goals. If I don't hit my goals, I'm depriving myself of Netflix for a week or something like that. So, I mean, that's my short answer, but the long answer, that I would welcome you to stay here for the discussions that we're going to break out to in a few minutes.
Okay, Steve, you're next.
Me, Steve?
Steve Fox.
Yeah. So I've got this written down here. Just real briefly, John, how do you mediate between escapism and taking necessary rest when you're pursuant of some goal?
I personally, I see the indication of guilt. I see guilt as an indicator. So if I'm engaged in a pleasure, if I'm engaged in an escape or an activity or something, and I feel a sense of guilt, that inherently tells me that I don't personally believe I've earned it. So I didn't do enough in whatever realm of my life that is. And this threshold is very idiosyncratic. So in other words, some people might say, to a common thing a lot of people say to me is, oh, you need to loosen up, you need to have fun more, etc. I am traditionally very hard on myself. I do have very high standards for myself, so I don't really let myself, I guess, fall on that side of the spectrum. And maybe I could use a little bit more balance personally, but I would look at guilt as an indicator of escapism. So if I'm indulging in something, if I'm indulging in an activity or an entertainment or a pleasure, and I feel like, okay, I've had enough of this, or I feel guilty, I step back and I say, okay, why do I feel guilty? Did I do enough this week? Did I actually hit my goals? Or am I lying to myself? Am I using this as an escapism, or am I actually using this as a reward? So that's personal.
Next up is Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, hi, John. I always like your talks. It was really great. I wanted to add something, and I wanted your reaction. So I know I always refer to teaching, but to get people to remember something, we usually have to attach some emotion to it. So I would like to say that the trials and tribulations that Sebastian went through made it more meaningful for him because it was emotional, versus if he just stayed home and read a book about traveling to Egypt, it wouldn't have really stuck with him, or it wouldn't have caused him to learn and to really have this learning stick. And then to me, I think the theme, when you read something, you could come up with 10 different themes, but one of the themes would be the grass is always greener, in my opinion. So I just wanted your reaction, maybe.
All right, so a few things. The first point to the emotional reaction, that is absolutely true. Last weekend on Flowers for Algernon, forget the verbatim quote. I think it's like, human intellect that hasn't been tempered by affection is worthless. That's the quote. And I was talking about the disparity between like information versus information in a narrative format with mythology and archetypes. So it's, in other words, it's emotionalized. You're going to remember it a lot more. And that's why like humanity has these oral traditions of telling these stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are hundreds and hundreds of pages, and we committed them to memory because of the archetypes, because of the emotional undertones, because of the symbolism and metaphors. And they were emotional in nature. So they took the principles, they emotionalized them, our ancestors, and that's how they were able to retain them in memory. So you're absolutely right on that point. And the second point, the grass is always greener. I actually did an entire video, it's on my YouTube channel, about that. I don't think that's, some people listen to that and they get discouraged. They say, okay, so like, we're never going to be satisfied, so why try anything? Like, that's a very slippery slope into weak-minded nihilism. I think that's actually a very positive motivating factor. And what I did is I instantiated this with a situation, actually, in a book of all books, Alice in Wonderland actually instantiated that philosophy of the grass is always greener on her part of her journey. And then also Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky, where he is saying we love the process of attaining but not having attained. So once we get something, we immediately develop and ossify a contemptuous attitude toward it, and we don't begin to value it, and then we go for the next newest thing. And I think that's fine. That actually that phenomenon is what keeps us growing, what keeps us developing, and keeps us actualizing our potential. For nothing in life, nothing organic in nature, nothing in this universe is stagnant. Everything is growing, evolving, expanding, adapting. And if we are to I guess stay satisfied, I don't like when people justify gratitude for complacency. In short, I don't like that attitude. It's positively intentioned, but it's justifying mediocrity, I think. So I think that grass is greener syndrome is good, and we should chase the objects of our desire forever.
Last two questions are from Sarah and Gretchen. Sarah, go ahead.
Yes. So, in your view, what's the worth of investment if a dream, like we originally viewed it, is not possible? In the story, he invested all his years and times to reach his treasure that was not at the right place. And in other circumstances, for example, a company someone wants to work for becomes bankrupt, and that person invested so many years in it. So what are the benefits that you see in that without considering it like a loss of time?
All right. So in the second example you just gave, the practicality of a person investing in a time, investing in a position, I would say that person isn't actually investing in anything. I would say that is the type of person who works at a company for 15 years and doesn't have 15 years experience, instead has 1 year experience 15 times. Okay. Jim Rohn, somebody who I've learned a lot from, he's like pretty much a founder of the whole personal development industry. He always says, work harder on yourself than you work on your job. So if you work harder on yourself, nothing can be taken from you. Okay. Ben Franklin says, if you empty your purse into your head, you can never lose it. Okay. And he says, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. So in other words, if I invested all my time, all my resources, all of my money into my competence, into my skill set, into a high value skill, let's say sales, let's say management, let's say leadership, let's say developing people, let's say teaching. Okay. Whatever you look at, or maybe it's not only high value financially, but also it's emotionally rewarding. So you find those two things, coalesce them, and you develop that skill set. It does not matter what's going on in the economy. It does not matter what's going on in an organization. You will find another company that wants you because you are so valuable to the marketplace. Or I would argue you do some freelancing, or you're inherently valuable on your own, so you take risks and develop clients of your own if you have your own skill set. So you shouldn't, I believe you shouldn't invest your time in companies. You shouldn't invest your time in being loyal to other people's dreams. You should invest in your competence, in your skill set. So regardless of what's going on outside you, you always have that power within you.
Last question is from Gretchen, and then we're going to go to breakout rooms to discuss, discuss the questions that John is going to pose for us. Gretchen, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Incredible. John, just as a reference point, I mean, I got out of a relationship that was, that made the movie Sleeping with the Enemy look like a lullaby. And that gave me the fortitude to put myself through college. And I got a Bachelor of Science degree, moved from $13 to $50 an hour right away, and went from at one point being homeless to making 6 figures. My question is, though, that was like, I was never going to be in that situation again. And like to someone else's point, is that emotional attachment, that emotional feeling that got me through that. And my question is, though, how do you determine when you don't have that emotional attachment and that emotional thing to get you through? How do you determine what is a worthwhile thing to go after? How do you discern whether it's like the guy, I mean, a dream, right? So how do you determine whether it's worthy of your effort or not, is my question.
That's a very good question. It's actually one of the questions that it's actually kind of a little bit amalgamating both of the questions that I posed for the breakout group. So I'll save the long answer for that. But the short answer, I would say, look at your, I guess, discrepancies between you and the world. Try to isolate like your niche. Try to isolate what motivates you in two emotional polarities. So firstly, what really excites you, what really gets you hyped up, what really gets you like emotionally fulfilled and in a sense of deep appreciation and compassion and loving and a sacredness and an appreciation for life, like all those positive emotions. But also ask yourself, what bothers you about the world? Okay. And I think your answer to that, like what bothers you most, like what one thing bothers you most about the world? And if it bothers you that much, you should adopt a moral responsibility to fix it. Okay. So that's a very good, I think, approach to manifesting something that should be idiosyncratic. Because what bothers me in the world is it might not be what bothers you most in the world. Okay. So you might have a different perspective or different lens or different life experiences or different strengths or weaknesses or resources that I don't have access to. And that leaves you better equipped to go on that journey to fix that thing that bothers you. And also coalesce those things that elicit positive emotional responses in you as well.
Is there anything that you would say, I'm sorry, just as a follow-up, Is there anything that you would say would would be a deterrent to an intellectually wise deterrent to pursuing something?
What do you mean by that?
Okay, so let's say, okay, so he had this dream, right? And he's going on this dream, and that's what he based his journey
Right.
on, right? Okay, so is there anything that I mean, obviously people have like pipe dreams, or can be have this pie in the sky kind of attitude. What would you say would be the discerning factor where someone could rationalize and say, okay, this is a worthy goal to pursue, or it is not?
That is actually my third question that I've designed for the moderation groups. But I think this is inherently subjective. So I think we're going to, in the discussion groups, we're going to hear a lot of different answers, because if you play devil's advocate, you could take Santiago and his journey and say the first step of him leaving his town to even be a shepherd was irrational. All right. So it's like you could take any iota of those 9 major tribulations, which there was more, by the way. I only took 9 major ones. You could choose at any iota, like where you personally would have left off, or you would have quit, or you would have found something else. Maybe somebody here would have gone with, if they were Santiago, they would have gone with the first girl in the first town, or maybe the second girl, or maybe they would have just quit when they were in the middle of the desert, or whatever. You know what I mean? So you can rationalize it all the way down to the very first step of him going into his journey. So that's entirely subjective, and that's part of the reason why I established those. So with that said, Shrikant, is this a good time to go into 3 questions?
Perfect.
Okay, cool.
So go ahead and. Yeah.
All right. So the whole nature of this discussion is basically like invest more, sacrifice more, struggle more, go through more tribulation so you can value something more, because that's going to be commensurate. The more you invest into something, the more valuable it's going to be. So can we play devil's advocate? And with the devil's advocate in mind, the first question is, can you think of something that is worth having that is attained easily? I don't mean like inherently given things like family or like birth, like things you already have. I mean things that you can get, and they're also very high in value to you. So can you think of any manifestations of that? Second question is kind of related to the question we were just talking about. How can you define or realize your personal legend, as the story calls it, which can be like your dream or like your direction you should go in your life? Is this like a sense of like fate? Do you only have one goal in your life, or is it ever changing with every year of your life and all your experiences, etc.? So what are some ways we can kind of realize what we should do with our life, in short? The third question is actually pretty much encapsulating the question we just got, is how do you know when to abandon your goals? Okay, so some goals, some rewards are definitely not worth the time, or the struggle, or the tribulations, or the effort, or the resources it might take. So what are some clear ways we can like draw lines and say, okay, you know what, I'm out. That's too much. There's my threshold. I'm done. This is not worth it. I'm going to correct course. I'm going to go do something else. So quick recap. 1, what is something that is worth having that is easily attained? Number 2, how can we realize our personal legend? And 3, when do we abandon our goals? So with that said, Shrikant will manually shuffle us into discussion groups.
Yes.